When we talk about the Tudor dynasty, many immediately think of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, but almost no one mentions the king's favorite illegitimate son, Henry FitzRoy, a young man who had it all: luxury, power, unimaginable privileges, and star status at court, yet who met such a dark and disturbing death that it still raises doubts, speculation, and controversial theories to this day. We are facing a story that mixes secret love intrigues, scandals suppressed by the crown, promises of power crushed by illness, and a calculated silence that turned his death into one of the most mysterious episodes in 16th century England. Imagine a boy of only 17, legitimized by the king himself, raised as a potential alternative heir, surrounded by flatterers and hopes, who suddenly finds himself a prisoner of his own fragility, a victim of a disease that spared neither rich nor poor, and that turned promising young lives into ghosts. The most disturbing part is that, at the height of his decline, while coughing up blood and losing strength, the court chose silence, suppressing any detail about his agony so as not to tarnish the image of power Henry VIII so carefully cultivated. And it is precisely this silence that makes his death even more chilling. There were no tribute, no official mourning, just the oblivion imposed by politics. But was this merely the story of a young man destroyed by tuberculosis? Or is there something darker that was never told? Today, we are going to dive deep into the behind the scenes of this life marked by privileges and shadows, exploring his secret passions, his bold declarations that scandalized the court, the political pressure he carried on his shoulders, and the cruel decline that led him to his end. And before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Subscribing is essential because it helps YouTube understand that you enjoy this type of controversial and mysterious historical content, which allows the video to reach more people and keeps the production of such impactful stories alive. Personally, what surprised me most in case was the coldness of in treating the death of someone so important as if it were merely an inconvenient detail to erase. A silence that reveals far more than any ceremony ever could. So don't take your eyes off the screen, because the final revelation of this story will shock you and may completely change the way you see the reign. Henry FitzRoy's childhood was one of the most peculiar and at the same time one of the most privileged in all of 16th century England, because from the moment he was born, he carried a fascinating paradox. He was a bastard, but a beloved, protected bastard, and above all, recognized by the most powerful man in Europe at the time, King Henry VIII. Unlike many other illegitimate children who lived in the shadows or were kept silent, FitzRoy was not only acknowledged but also elevated to a position bordering on royalty. Imagine for a moment what it meant to grow up under the proud gaze of a father who, despite all the political and religious problems he faced, found time to display his son as a trophy of power, while other noble children followed routines defined by strict discipline, demanding tutors, and the constant reminder that they must serve the crown. FitzRoy grew up in an environment of pampering, flattery, and privilege. From an early age, he had personal servants solely for his studies, others just to manage his meals, and still others to ensure he was always dressed in the finest fabrics of silks imported from Italy, linen from Flanders, and hand-embroidered garments made by artisans hired exclusively for the king's son. For a boy of only 8 or 9, this meant living almost like a prince, even without the official title of heir to the throne. What may be even more curious is the way Henry VIII shaped his son from a young age. The king seemed to have a mixture of pride and hope in the boy, which was reflected in how the court treated him. The nobles, fearing to displease the king, never dared to criticize FitzRoy. On the contrary, they competed to please him, offering expensive gifts, sophisticated toys, and even exotic animals such as falcons and hunting dogs, which were common symbols of status at the time. Thus, FitzRoy grew up believing that the world revolved around him and that his presence, even as a child, could decide destiny. This sense of power from childhood shaped much of his personality, making him confident, sometimes arrogant, but also extremely certain that he had a special role to play in England's history. Unlike ordinary children, he knew no restriction. If he wanted sweets, they were immediately brought from the royal kitchen. If he asked for a new training sword, blacksmiths were summoned. If he showed curiosity about music, the court's best musicians were invited to perform just to entertain him. This treatment made him, in the eyes of others, a sort of small sun around which everyone orbited. Another notable aspect of his childhood was education. Although pampered, he was not neglected intellectually. On the contrary, he was placed under the tutelage of some of the greatest humanist masters of the time. He learned Latin, French, Greek, and even rudimentary Italian, something rare even for legitimate princes. He was taught to read the classics, understand philosophy, and recite poetry, but all in a much more indulgent environment than other noble students faced. If FitzRoy grew tired of lessons, there were no severe punishment. The tutor would simply soften the tone or find another way to entertain the student. This flexibility, which would normally be considered harmful to discipline, only reinforced in FitzRoy the idea that nothing would be denied to him. His education there was not just a learning process, but a constant exercise in elevating his personal work. He was not just another student. He was the king's son, and that stood above any book or lesson. In social life, from a very young age, FitzRoy was treated as a public figure. He attended banquets and celebrations, paraded alongside his father on special occasions, and had seats of honor reserved for him at solemn events. Many foreign ambassadors noted his presence with curiosity, describing him as a charismatic young man with pleasing features and an aura that set him apart from other children. For Europe, which watched with concern Henry VIII's lack of a legitimate male heir, FitzRoy was almost a symbol of stability, a kind of hidden card the king could use to ensure the continuity of the Tudor dynasty. This further heightened the perception that the boy was destined for something grand, and in young FitzRoy's mind, this was not a hypothesis. It was a right. It is important to remember that at that time, illegitimacy was seen as a terrible stain, something that could condemn a child to a life of obscurity. But FitzRoy completely escaped this fate thanks to his father's love and favoritism. Henry VIII not only granted him grand titles, such as Duke of Richmond and Somerset, but also ensured that his upbringing was that of someone prepared to govern. This made FitzRoy grow not just as a privileged bastard, but as a prince in every way, except in name. And it is precisely this contradiction that makes his childhood so fascinating. He lived between two worlds, carrying the stigma of illegitimate birth, but enjoying all the advantages of a legitimate one. This duality created in him an almost mystical sense of uniqueness, as if he had been chosen to break the rules and prove that even a bastard could reign. In his most private moments, when he was not surrounded by advisors or flatterers, accounts suggest FitzRoy had a fertile imagination. He enjoyed hearing stories of legendary kings, knights who defied conventions, and was especially captivated by tales in which unlikely characters reached the throne. These stories were not just entertainment. They acted as fuel for his already inflated self-esteem. He saw in them a reflection of himself, a justification to believe that, despite not being legitimate, he had a greater destiny. This entire childhood of luxury and privileges shaped Henry FitzRoy in a way that would have been impossible for any other child of the time. While ordinary boys learned to cope with limits, he grew up without boundaries. While others were punished for mistakes, he was forgiven with smiles. While many struggled to be remembered, he was celebrated simply for existing. This combination of paternal love, material privileges, elite education, and constant adulation not only defined who he would become, but also created the perfect backdrop for his life to later be marked by controversy, audacity, and, unfortunately, a fall as swift and cold as the rise of his golden. Henry FitzRoy's relationships were always a central part of his, because from an early age his personal life was placed under the microscope of the English court, a space where every gesture was interpreted, every friendship was seen as an alliance, and every romance could turn into a political scandal. Growing up in the heart of Henry VIII's palace meant living in an environment where intimacy was almost impossible, and even the size of a 16-year-old could be transformed into stateroom. The fact that FitzRoy was a recognized bastard, yet still surrounded by privileges, made his love life and relationships even more scrutinized, as many saw him as a valuable piece in the political chessboard of the Tudor dynasty. From a very young age, he was courted not only by ladies enchanted by his charm and position, but also by noble families who dreamed of linking their names to someone with royal blood and the king's protection. Reports suggest that even in adolescence, FitzRoy stood out for his healthy appearance, confident smile, and the way he carried himself in public. This naturally made him attractive to the ladies of the court, who saw in him not just a handsome young man, but also a ticket to greater influence with the king. Although officially still considered too young for serious commitments, it is not difficult to imagine that he experienced his first crushes amid the luxurious corridors of the Tudor palace, always under watchful eyes and whispers echoing through the wall. Many scholars believe he engaged in innocent flirtations, but also in bolder encounters for the time. Encounters that, if exposed, could have caused real scandals, because any misstep by FitzRoy directly reflected on King Henry VIII's image. It was in this context that the arranged marriage with Mary Howard, daughter of the powerful Duke of Norfolk, arose. This union, celebrated when Fitzroy was only 14, was motivated not by love, but by politics, as was common at the Duke of Norfolk, one of the most influential men in England, had much to gain by placing his daughter alongside the king's favorite son, and Henry VIII saw the alliance as a way to further reinforce Fitzroy's prestige and stability. Mary Howard, for her part, was young, discreet, and from a respected family, making her an ideal choice for a wife. But for Fitzroy, who had grown pampered, free, and accustomed to having his wishes fulfilled, the idea of being bound by an arranged marriage was not particularly appealing. Contemporary sources suggest that, although respectful, he did not show great enthusiasm, and indeed, the couple never consummated the union, something unusual even by 16th century standards. Despite being officially married, Fitzroy continued to maintain the aura of a young gallant. Rumors about his romantic inclinations were constant. It is said that he had a particular fondness for older ladies of the court, married women who, feeling secure in their noble positions, allowed themselves flirtations bordering on imprudence. Some more daring accounts claim that Fitzroy liked to push limits and sometimes boasted in private circles of conquests that, if true, would have caused enormous repercussions. Even if much of this may have been exaggeration or gossip created in the palace corridors, the mere existence of such rumors was enough to strengthen his reputation as an impulsive and daring young man. Alongside romantic relationships, political intrigues inevitably intertwined with his personal life. Fitzroy could not have friends innocently, because any young noble approaching him would be seen as trying to gain influence with the king. This meant that even his friendships were interpreted as alliances. Many noble youths competed for Fitzroy's attention, offering gifts, dedicating poems, or approaching him with flattery that, in practice, were attempts to open political doors. This created an environment in which it was difficult to distinguish who truly liked him sincerely and who was merely exploiting his position. This circle of interested friendships shaped in Fitzroy a natural distrust while simultaneously reinforcing his, as he realized he could manipulate this network of flatterers for his own pleasure and interests. However, behind the court's backstage, there were also tensions directly involving Fitzroy and his role in the Tudor lineage. As a recognized illegitimate son, he was seen by many as a threat, especially during periods when Henry VIII still had no legitimate surviving son. This meant that his figure was constantly attacked through intrigues and malicious rumors. Some spread stories claiming Fitzroy was too sickly to govern, or that his morality was questionable due to his supposed romantic affairs. All this contributed to creating an atmosphere of controversy surrounding him at practically every social event at court. One particularly cited episode was at a banquet, where, intoxicated and surrounded by close friends, Fitzroy allegedly made statements that echoed through the palace corridors for weeks. He supposedly mocked the king's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, saying they were nothing more than discardable pieces on a chessboard, because in the end, the king would always need a male heir to maintain the dynasty strong. These words, truly spoken, demonstrated not only the arrogance of a young man who believed he was destined for the throne, but also how his indulgent upbringing made him feel untouchable, even in such sensitive matters. Still, behind all the public image of a gallant and arrogant prince, there was also the weight of responsibility. Fitzroy knew that his marriage to Mary Howard was a state alliance, and that sooner or later, he was expected to produce descendants who could further reinforce the Tudor family's position. Fate intervened, and his fragile health and premature death prevented any fulfillment of these. His relationship with Mary ended almost before it began, and the young widow was forever remembered as the wife who never truly experienced a marriage. Looking at Fitzroy's youth, it is impossible not to see how his personal life was simultaneously fascinating and tragic. He intensely lived the privileges of being the king's favorite son, experienced romances and flirtations that fueled court gossip, but also faced the intrigues and pressures of an environment that viewed his relationships not just as love stories, but as potential shifts in the destiny of an entire kingdom. He grew up surrounded by people who desired him, some out of affection, others out of ambition, shaping a young man who believed he was irresistible, not only to women, but also to the most powerful men in England, who saw in him an opportunity to get closer to the throne. His love life was more than a series of intimate experiences. It reflected the entire atmosphere of seduction, manipulation, and power that defined the Tudor court. The controversies surrounding Henry Fitzroy began early, almost simultaneously with his official recognition by Henry VIII. The mere fact of being a legitimized bastard, granted grand titles, was itself controversial, as it challenged traditional noble conventions and stirred resentment among those who saw his rise as an insult to the established hierarchy. Old nobles, proud of their legitimate lineages and service to the crown, whispered in the shadows that the boy was merely the product of the king's whim and did not deserve such consideration. But Henry VIII, in his desire to display the absolute power he wielded, not only ignored the criticisms, but made a point of elevating FitzRoy above many noblemen, inevitably creating murmurs and tensions. Growing up in this environment, the boy learned early that his name was tied to controversy, and rather than shrink away, he seemed to relish it. Reports suggest that even at a young age, FitzRoy made irreverent comments at banquets and private meetings, statements that many would have considered imprudent for a boy of his age. One of the most famous phrases attributed to him was reportedly said during a festive meal, when he declared, "If my father wishes, I can be king, and no pope on earth can prevent it." Spoken amid laughter, this declaration was not merely the fantasy of an overconfident adolescent. It was a direct affront to the authority of the Catholic Church at a time when Henry VIII was already waging his battle to separate from Rome. For those present, hearing young FitzRoy speak with such conviction reflected the king's own arrogance. Yet it was unsettling, as it made clear that the boy genuinely believed the crown could be his, despite being illegitimate. Another controversy that tarnished his reputation was the way he treated his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. Although they were Henry VIII's legitimate daughters, they were in a fragile position, especially because the king eagerly desired a male heir. FitzRoy, buoyed by his father's favoritism, allegedly made cruel remarks about, calling them discardable pieces in the game of power. To the court, which understood the importance of every royal heir, such statements seemed an absolute scandal, revealing disdain for his own family and excessive confidence in his special status. Some claim he even insinuated that Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, would never be more than a decoration for foreign alliances, something that, with the passage of history, proved ironically incorrect, as Elizabeth would become one of England's greatest queens. FitzRoy's scandalous statements were not limited to family or religious matters. He also showed little diplomacy when speaking about nobles and foreign ambassadors. On one occasion, meeting representatives from France, he allegedly made a crude joke about the weakness of French kings, leaving his tutors desperate to manage the potential political fallout from what seemed a juvenile remark. But FitzRoy appeared unconcerned with the gravity of his, perhaps because he had grown up believing that his father's shadow would protect him from any consequences. This irreverent and arrogant behavior was simultaneously admired by young courtiers who saw a bold spirit in him, and hated by older men who viewed him as a threat to the balance of power. His personal life was also a source of rumors fueling controversy. Many said that even while married to Mary Howard, FitzRoy maintained a parallel life of romantic adventures and indiscreet flirtations. Naturally, for a young man surrounded by flatterers and aware of his beauty and status, indulging in such excesses was almost inevitable. But in the Tudor court, where every whisper could turn into intrigue, it became fuel for gossip spreading from hall to hall. Some claimed he was involved with married women, others that he held secret meetings with ladies hoping to advance socially through him. Although it is difficult to verify the truth of these stories, their very existence was enough to cement his image as a scandalous, spoiled, and reckless youth. A particularly controversial aspect of his life was his proximity to succession debates. Many believe that Henry VIII might at some point consider FitzRoy as an official heir, fully legitimized. This naturally provoked intense reactions at court, and any comment FitzRoy made on the subject became explosive. Records suggest that, in moments of relaxation, he would claim he was better prepared for the throne than any princess could ever be, a statement that, to the eyes of attentive counselors, was not only provocative, but a veiled threat to the position of the king's legitimate daughters. Even in more personal matters, FitzRoy seemed unable to restrain himself. At parties, he would often drink excessively and utter improper remarks about counselors and even Parliament itself. On one such occasion, he allegedly said, "England does not need old men deciding laws, but young men with hot blood capable of fighting." This statement, which may have sounded like a playful bravado to him, was viewed by many as disrespectful to the kingdom's political traditions and reinforced the idea that he was too reckless to be taken seriously. It must be remembered that at the time, any misstep could be amplified enormously. The Tudor court was a place where political rivals exploited any poorly chosen word to craft narratives against opponents. Thus, Even if some phrases attributed to FitzRoy were exaggerated or even invented, his reputation as a controversial youth was quickly established. He became a figure discussed not only for his deeds, but above all, for his. Ultimately, this reputation contributed to many seeing him as a dangerous figure, someone who, had he lived longer, might have provoked even greater crises within the delicate political and religious balance of the period. Behind all this scandalous image, however, was a human component. FitzRoy was young, raised amidst excess, surrounded by people who never said no to him, and placed in a position where every word carried state weight. Perhaps, in his mind, he was merely having fun, expressing pride in being the king's favorite son. But to the court, his statements were silent bombs, fueling intrigues, generating rumors, and increasing the perception that this spoiled bastard should never be near the crown. This mix of youthful irreverence and political irresponsibility is what makes his legacy so remarkable. FitzRoy was remembered as much for his words as for his, often more for the former than the latter. Henry FitzRoy was always seen as a young man full of promise, someone who grew up surrounded by luxury, privileges, and adoration. But his trajectory took an unexpected and painful turn when illness began to creep into his life during adolescence. The contrast between the brightness of his gilded youth and the cruel weight of disease is one of the most tragic parts of his story, as it shows how human frailty can impose itself even on those who seemed untouchable. During his early years, FitzRoy had everything. He was handsome, healthy, energetic, and radiated vitality, participating in hunts, tournaments, and banquets as if he were a true court star. But around the age of 15, subtle signs began to appear, initially ignored by those around him and even by himself. Recurring fevers, prolonged coughing, and unusual fatigue for a boy his age began to manifest. At first, doctors and advisors treated these as common colds or the consequences of restless nights, but over time, the symptoms worsened, revealing that something more serious was happening. At that time, tuberculosis was a feared and devastating disease, still without effective treatment. It slowly consumed the body and spirit, transforming healthy young people into shadows of themselves. FitzRoy, who had always been seen as vibrant and full of energy, came to be described as pale, thin, and constantly debilitated. This shocked all who knew, as the contrast with his public image was striking. Imagine a young man used to being the center of attention, entering halls in dazzling clothes with admiring eyes, now trying to hide his cough behind handkerchiefs and avoiding physical activities that had once been his passion. Hunting was a symbol of status and virility, but FitzRoy gradually became unable to participate, trading forests and open fields for closed rooms where doctors tried in vain to relieve his symptom. The decline was not only physical, but also emotional. FitzRoy knew his position was unique. He was the king's favorite son, a potential solution to the succession dilemmas that tormented Henry VIII. Yet, the disease called all of this into. In a world where strength, health, and virility were synonymous with power, being ill was seen as a sign of weakness, something that diminished his image in the eyes of others. Although he tried to maintain a confident demeanor in public, it is easy to imagine the psychological burden he carried in private. Chronicles of the time mention that he had become more introspective, at times melancholic, and that his gaze no longer held the same bold brightness as before. For someone who had grown up believing the world revolved around him, confronting his own fragility was a devastating. The court doctor, limited by the knowledge of the era, tried various treatments, from herbs and bloodletting to strict rest, but nothing seemed to halt the disease's advance. Each month, the young duke grew weaker, thinner, more distant from the vibrant figure who had once captivated so many. Rumors began to spread. Some said FitzRoy would not reach adulthood, others that the king sought desperate ways to cure his son, including turning to healers and less orthodox practices. The official silence about his condition only fueled speculation. For the court, it was inconceivable to admit that the young man representing hope for the Tudor dynasty was on the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, FitzRoy faced not only physical pain, but also social and political pressure. He knew expectations rested on his marriage to Mary Howard, expectations of producing heirs who could strengthen his position and secure the future of his lineage. But the progressive weakening of his health prevented the union from being consummated, making it clear that those promises of stability would not materialize. This failure, albeit involuntary, was another shadow over his reputation. Rivals and critics at court were ready to use his frailty as an argument to delegitimize any plan that placed him as heir. With every coughing fit, with every trace of blood on his handkerchiefs, it became increasingly evident to those around him that FitzRoy was not destined for the throne. The impact on his daily life profound. Banquets where he had once shone became uncomfortable moments in which he had to display energy he no longer possessed. Parties became stages for almost theatrical efforts to conceal his weakness. Yet the court's watchful eyes noticed the difference. The one once seen as an unofficial prince, full of life and youthful arrogance, now seemed fragile, almost ethereal. Even his posture changed. Where there had been confidence, now there was subtle hesitation. Where there had been boldness, a heavy silence emerged. Perhaps most striking in this phase was how FitzRoy reacted to it all. Some accounts suggest he sought solace in faith, asking for spiritual guidance and finding comfort in prayer. Others indicate that even weakened, he still retained traces of his former audacity, privately declaring that the body may fail, but royal blood never fades. These words, if true, reveal a young man torn between accepting his condition and refusing to surrender entirely to the cruel fate imposed upon him. As the disease progressed, the court entered a state of denial. Henry VIII, famous for his vanity and relentless pursuit of glory, found it difficult to confront the reality of seeing his favorite son waste away. Many believe the king tried to hide the severity of the situation, avoiding public mourning or displays of weakness. This created a strange atmosphere. Everyone knew FitzRoy was growing more ill, but few dared to comment openly. In this scenario, the young man became almost ghost-like. Alive, yet treated as someone who could depart at any moment. The glamour that had defined his childhood and adolescence dissolved in the face of the relentless reality of disease. FitzRoy, educated to shine, to be admired, to bear the potential weight of the crown, was reduced to a fragile body and an interrupted. The fall was as swift as it was cruel, and perhaps it is precisely this transition from luxury to decline that makes his story so striking. He lived as if he were eternal, but he was remembered as the young man who had everything and lost it all, not by choice, but to an invisible and incurable enemy of his time. Henry FitzRoy was always seen as a young man full of promise, someone who grew up surrounded by luxury, privileges, and adoration. But his trajectory took an unexpected and painful turn when illness began to creep into his life during adolescence. The contrast between the brightness of his gilded youth and the cruel weight of disease is one of the most tragic parts of his story, as it shows how human frailty can impose itself even on those who seemed untouchable. During his early years, FitzRoy had everything. He was handsome, healthy, energetic, and radiated vitality, participating in hunts, tournaments, and banquets as if he were a true court star. But around the age of 15, subtle signs began to appear, initially ignored by those around him and even by himself. Recurring fevers, prolonged coughing, and unusual fatigue for a boy his age began to manifest. At first, doctors and advisors treated these as common colds or the consequences of restless nights. But over time, the symptoms worsened, revealing that something more serious was happening. At that time, tuberculosis was a feared and devastating disease. Still without effective treatment, it slowly consumed the body and spirit, transforming healthy young people into shadows of themselves. FitzRoy, who had always been seen as vibrant and full of energy, came to be described as pale, thin, and constantly debilitated. This shocked all who knew him, as the contrast with his public image was striking. Imagine a young man used to being the center of attention, entering halls in dazzling clothes with admiring eyes, now trying to hide his cough behind handkerchiefs and avoiding physical activities that had once been his passion. Hunting was a symbol of status and virility, but FitzRoy gradually became unable to participate, trading forests and open fields for closed rooms where doctors tried in vain to relieve his symptom. The decline was not only physical, but also emotional. FitzRoy knew his position was unique. He was the king's favorite son, a potential solution to the succession dilemmas that tormented Henry VIII. Yet the disease called all of this into question. In a world where strength, health, and virility were synonymous with power, being ill was seen as a sign of weakness, something that diminished his image in the eyes of others. Although he tried to maintain a confident demeanor in public, it is easy to imagine the psychological burden he carried in private. Chronicles of the time mention that he had become more introspective, at times melancholic, and that his gaze no longer held the same bold brightness as for someone who had grown up believing the world revolved around him. Confronting his own fragility was a devastating. The court doctor, limited by the knowledge of the era, tried various treatments, from herbs and bloodletting to strict rest, but nothing seemed to halt the disease's advance. Each month, the young duke grew weaker, thinner, more distant from the vibrant figure who had once captivated so many. Rumors began to spread. Some said FitzRoy would not reach adulthood, others that the king sought desperate ways to cure his son, including turning to healers and less orthodox practices. The official silence about his condition only fueled speculation. For the court, it was inconceivable to admit that the young man representing hope for the Tudor dynasty was on the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, Fitzroy faced not only physical pain, but also social and political. He knew expectations rested on his marriage to Mary Howard, expectations of producing heirs who could strengthen his position and secure the future of his lineage. But the progressive weakening of his health prevented the union from being consummated, making it clear that those promises of stability would not materialize. This failure, albeit involuntary, was another shadow over his rivals and critics at court were ready to use his frailty as an argument to delegitimize any plan that placed him as heir. With every coughing fit, with every trace of blood on his handkerchiefs, it became increasingly evident to those around him that Fitzroy was not destined for the throne. The impact on his daily life was profound. Banquets where he had once shone became uncomfortable moments in which he had to display energy he no longer possessed. Parties became stages for almost theatrical efforts to conceal his weakness. Yet the court's watchful eyes noticed the difference. The one once seen as an unofficial prince, full of life and youthful arrogance, now seemed fragile, almost ethereal. Even his posture, where there had been confidence, now there was subtle hesitation. Where there had been boldness, a heavy silence. Perhaps most striking in this phase was how Fitzroy reacted. Some accounts suggest he sought solace in faith, asking for spiritual guidance and finding comfort in prayer. Others indicate that, even weakened, he still retained traces of his former audacity, privately declaring that the body may fail, but royal blood never fades. These words, if true, reveal a young man torn between accepting his condition and refusing to surrender entirely to the cruel fate imposed upon him. As the disease progressed, the court entered a state of denial. Henry VIII, famous for his vanity and relentless pursuit of glory, found it difficult to confront the reality of seeing his favorite son waste away. Many believe the king tried to hide the severity of the situation, avoiding public mourning or displays of weakness. This created a strange atmosphere. Everyone knew Fitzroy was growing more ill, but few dared to comment openly. In this scenario, the young man became almost ghost-like, alive, yet treated as someone who could depart at any moment. The glamour that had defined his childhood and adolescence dissolved in the face of the relentless reality of disease. Fitzroy, educated to shine, to be admired, to bear the potential weight of the crown, was reduced to a fragile body and an interrupted destiny. The fall was as swift as it was cruel, and perhaps it is precisely this transition from luxury to decline that makes his story so striking. He lived as if he were eternal, but he was remembered as the young man who had everything and lost it all, not by choice, but to an invisible and incurable enemy of his time. The legacy of Henry Fitzroy is at once fascinating and melancholic, as it blends the promise of a grand future with the almost deliberate forgetting that followed his death. He was born as Henry VIII's favored son, carrying immense expectations on his shoulder, living surrounded by privileges and luxury that few could imagine. Yet his short life and early death condemned him to an ambiguous place in historical memory. For a long time, Fitzroy was remembered only in footnotes, mentioned as the king's legitimized illegitimate son, a young duke who could have altered the succession but disappeared too soon to leave a deep. Still, the way he is viewed today reveals much about how our perception of the past can transform as we revisit forgotten stories. At the time, his death was shrouded in silence and concealment. The king himself, devastated, yet too proud to show vulnerability, ensured that there were no grand ceremonies or public honors. This decision had a direct impact on collective memory. By not celebrating Fitzroy's life, the Tudor court virtually erased his presence, as if he had been merely a detail amid the great intrigues of Henry VIII's reign. For generations, this caused Fitzroy to be remembered in a nearly faded way, without the same dramatic aura as figures like Anne Boleyn, Catherine of Aragon, or even the king's legitimate children. However, over time, scholars began to wonder what might have happened if Fitzroy had survived. This exercise in imagining an alternate future helped reignite interest in his figure. After all, if Henry VIII had lost hope of producing a legitimate male heir, it would not have been impossible for Fitzroy to have been legitimized and placed as successor. This could have radically changed the course of English history, perhaps preventing the rise of Edward VI, Mary I, and even Elizabeth I. Today, many historians enjoy discussing this possibility, and such speculation keeps Fitzroy's memory alive as someone who did not fulfill his destiny but could have changed everything if he had had more. This legacy of what could have been is one of the main reasons his name still appears in historical debates. Another aspect that shapes his memory is the contrast between the glamour of his youth and the cruelty of his. He was raised as an unofficial prince, surrounded by luxury, educated for refinement and power, enjoying all the privileges of a royal son despite being ill. To the people and the court, Fitzroy was a kind of living promise of Tudor continuity. This brilliance, followed by the decay caused by tuberculosis and the silence surrounding his death, created an almost literary narrative, the beautiful, loved, and privileged young man swallowed by life's fragility. This tragic image, in a way, also contributed to him being remembered as a symbol of unfulfilled promise, someone who represents both the glory and vulnerability of the Tudor dynasty. In cultural memory, FitzRoy is often portrayed as a background figure in films, series, and historical novels. Unlike other Tudor personalities, he rarely takes center stage, but appears in secondary roles that remind the audience that Henry VIII once had a son who could have changed the course of succession. In recent years, with the growing popular interest in the Tudor dynasty, especially through productions like The Tudors, his name has resurfaced, sparking curiosity among those seeking to understand all sides of this intrigue-filled history. This resurgence, albeit modest, helps consolidate FitzRoy as a character who should not be forgotten, but understood within the web of expectations, silences, and tragedies that marked his life. Today, he is seen with a mixture of empathy and fascination. Empathy, because his story is that of a young man who had no choice over the direction of his life, shaped by his birth and his father's decisions, yet succumbed to an incurable disease in a cruel era. Fascination, because his trajectory offers a unique portrait of how power and privilege are not enough to escape human fate. His current image, therefore, is neither that of a glorious prince nor a forgotten bastard, but of a young man embodying life's fragility amid luxury and politics. When we look at FitzRoy today, we do not see only Henry VIII's favored son, but also a reminder that even those who seem to have everything could lose it all over. A curious aspect of his legacy is that it also serves as a mirror to better understand Henry VIII himself. FitzRoy's death profoundly affected the king, though he never admitted it publicly. Some believe that Henry's obsession with having a legitimate male heir intensified after FitzRoy's loss, explaining part of his later actions, including successive marriages and drastic decisions that changed England's face. In this way, indirectly, FitzRoy left a political legacy. His absence forced the king to seek alternatives that would end up shaping the entire Tudor history. This shows that even without living to occupy the throne, FitzRoy subtly but powerfully influenced the monarchy's course. Today, in academic research, FitzRoy is increasingly studied not only as Henry VIII's illegitimate son, but as a young man whose life reveals the excesses, contradictions, and vulnerabilities of the Tudor court. He is remembered as a reflection of the tensions between power and fragility, between the desire to perpetuate a dynasty and the impossibility of controlling fate. His current image is far more human and sensitive than the cold treatment his death received in the 16th century. It is as if, centuries later, FitzRoy has finally found a space for recognition, albeit late. Thus, Henry FitzRoy's legacy can be defined as that of an interrupted promise, a young man who never reigned, but whose life and death left deep marks on his father's heart, English politics, and the way we think about the vulnerability even of the most powerful. Today, when we remember him, we do not see him merely as a legitimized bastard or a shadow in the corridors of history, but as a figure who teaches us that behind luxury and crowns, there were human beings subject to the same pains, fears, and losses as anyone. And perhaps that is precisely what makes him so relevant. His memory reminds us that history is made not only by those who ruled, but also by those who could have ruled and were silenced by fear. We've reached the end of this dark yet fascinating story, and I believe you now understand why the death of Henry VIII's spoiled son, Henry FitzRoy, is remembered as one of the most chilling in the Tudor dynasty. He lived a life of luxury, privilege, and promise, yet ended his days engulfed in the silence of the court, erased as if he had never existed, a young man who could have completely changed England's destiny. This brutal contrast between the brilliance of his childhood and youth and the cold silence of his death is what makes his story so disturbing, and it's impossible not to wonder, what really happened behind the scenes? To what extent did the court choose to hide even deeper secrets? If you enjoyed this dive into a little discussed part of history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Subscribing is essential because it shows YouTube that you value this kind of content, helping the video reach more people and keeping the production of controversial and mysterious historical stories alive. For those who can and wish to support even further, there's the Super Thanks option, which directly helps the channel grow and bring ever deeper and more impactful narratives. And if you can't contribute financially, that's perfectly fine. Leave a comment about what you thought of this story, which part surprised you the most, and whether you believe there are still hidden truths about FitzRoy's death. Your opinion is very important and helps build a community of people who love uncovering the secrets of the past. And before you go, Don't miss the next video appearing on the screen right now. It's even more intriguing and captivating than this one, full of revelations you won't want to miss. Click and continue with me on this journey into the darkest and most fascinating side of history.